6 hours before the capture, Captain Elias Reyes had been standing on the bridge of the Meridian watching a blip on the long-range scanner that shouldn't have existed. "Confirm that reading," he said to the sensor officer. A young woman named Priya Okoye who had been with him for 2 tours and had never once given him a false alarm. "Tell me it's debris." "It's not debris, sir." Okoye's fingers moved fast across the console, pulling up a secondary confirmation feed. "Whatever it is, it's decelerating on approach vector, matching our heading almost exactly. That's not orbital mechanics. That's a decision." Reyes felt the particular cold settle into his chest that came before every first contact protocol he'd ever run, the one that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer weight of responsibility that came with representing an entire species in the first few minutes anyone from it ever spoke to a stranger. He'd trained for this his whole career. He'd never actually expected to be the one standing on the bridge when it happened for real. "Hail them," he said. "Standard first contact package. Peaceful intent. Request for parley. Nothing that reads as posturing." The reply, when it came 90 seconds later, was not words. It was a targeting lock, followed almost immediately by a weapons discharge that tore through the Meridian's shields like they were tissue paper. And the last thing Reyes remembered clearly before the world went white and silent was Okoye's voice cutting off mid-sentence and the deck tilting hard enough to throw him from his chair. He woke up in the egg-shaped cell with no memory of how he'd gotten there, and 11 minutes later, the wall in front of him stopped being a wall. The cell had no corners. That was the first thing Captain Elias Reyes noticed when the light came back on, and it bothered him more than the restraints around his wrists or the low hum vibrating through the floor. Every surface curved into the next, walls into ceiling into floor, like he was standing inside a hollowed-out egg. No shadows to hide in. No edges to brace against. Whoever had built this place understood that corners gave prisoners something to lean on, physically and otherwise, and had decided not to offer him either. He'd been awake for 11 minutes by his internal count, which was the only clock he trusted anymore since they'd taken his suit's chronometer along with everything else useful. 11 minutes of silence, broken only by the hum and the occasional click of something adjusting itself behind the curved walls. Long enough to catalog the room. Not long enough to find a way out of it. The Meridian's last transmission had been a distress beacon cut short mid-syllable. Reyes remembered the flash on the bridge, the way Ensign Okoye's voice had gone from calm to nothing in under 2 seconds, and then the deck had tilted and the lights had died and he'd woken up here, wherever here was, with no memory of the part in between. First contact wasn't supposed to go like this. First contact was supposed to be handshakes and translated pleasantries and a very long report full of careful diplomatic language. Instead it was this egg-shaped room and the smell of ozone and a species he hadn't even gotten a good look at yet. That changed when the wall in front of him simply wasn't a wall anymore. It didn't open like a door. It dissolved, the way morning fog dissolves off a windshield, revealing a chamber beyond that made Reyes's chest tighten before his mind caught up to why. 6 figures stood in a loose arc, tall and narrow, their skin the color of wet slate, their eyes set in vertical pairs that tracked him with unsettling precision. Behind them, mounted on a low pedestal, sat something that Reyes recognized immediately despite never having seen its exact shape before. Because some designs are universal once you understand their purpose. A weapon built to end a room, built to end a building. Built, if the yield markings etched into its casing meant anything close to what he thought they meant, to end considerably more than that. One of the figures stepped forward. Its voice, when it spoke, arrived not as sound but as pressure behind his eyes. Some kind of direct neural translation that made his vision swim for half a second. You will answer 3 questions. Your species numbers. Your species weapons. Your species intentions. Failure to answer results in termination. Reyes said nothing, partly because he genuinely didn't know if talking would help, and partly because 11 years in deep-range diplomatic service had taught him that silence, held correctly, said more than most sentences. The figure's eyes narrowed, all 4 of them at once. You do not understand your situation. I understand it fine, Reyes said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. You've got a nuclear device pointed at a sealed room with me in it. I'm guessing that's not actually a question. Something passed between the 6 figures, a ripple of clicking sounds too fast for him to parse. Then the lead one spoke again, and this time the pressure behind Reyes's eyes came with an edge of something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the beginning of real cruelty. Your species has a history. We have studied it. Your kind does not stop. Your kind does not yield. We have concluded that the only reliable method of neutralization is total neutralization. You will not be given the chance to prove that history correct. Reyes felt his pulse pick up, but he kept his face flat, the way he trained himself to during 3 separate hostage situations on 3 separate worlds, none of which had ended with a nuclear weapon aimed at his skull. He thought of the 200 people still aboard the crippled Meridian, wherever it was being held, and understood with total clarity that whatever happened in the next few minutes was the only thing he had any control over at all. You're going to detonate that in a sealed room, he said slowly. With me inside it, because you read our history and decided I was too dangerous to talk to. Correct. Then you already know how this ends, Reyes said. You just don't know why. The lead figure tilted its narrow head, an almost human gesture of confusion, and for a moment Reyes thought he'd bought himself another minute of conversation. He hadn't. The pedestal behind them began to glow, a rising amber light that pulsed in time with a countdown he couldn't hear but could feel in his teeth, and the 6 figures withdrew through a door that reformed behind them as smoothly as it had disappeared, sealing him back into the egg-shaped room alone. Reyes had time to think one clear thought before the light became everything. They have no idea what they just did. Then the room came apart in fire. Commander Vesithur had led 14 boarding actions in her career, 3 of them against species with technology that outmatched her own, and she had never once doubted an order to eliminate a threat before it eliminated her crew. That was the job. You didn't survive command in the coalition fleet by hesitating, and you didn't earn the rank of commander by second-guessing intelligence reports compiled by analysts who'd spent decades studying exactly this kind of enemy. The human species, according to those reports, was a paradox that resolved itself only through violence. A species that had detonated hundreds of nuclear devices on its own homeworld before it ever left orbit, that had built weapons capable of ending itself a dozen times over and then, instead of destroying them, had simply continued existing alongside them for centuries, daring itself not to press the button. A species that treated near annihilation as background noise. The analysts had a term for it, borrowed loosely from human vocabulary intercepted off old broadcast signals. Mutually assured survival. As if survival itself were a form of aggression. Ves had read the file on Captain Elias Reyes twice before authorizing the strike. Nothing in it suggested he was special among his kind. A career officer, decorated but not decorated exceptionally. The kind of steady, unremarkable competence that made him a perfectly ordinary specimen. That was precisely why she'd chosen him for the test. If an ordinary human survived what they were about to do, every human would survive it, and that was a piece of intelligence worth a great deal more than one captured officer's life. If he didn't survive, they'd learned the truth the report suggested. That humanity's reputation was inflated propaganda from a species desperate to seem unkillable. She watched the detonation through 3 redundant sensor feeds, each one washing out white for 4 seconds before the automated filters compensated. When the image resolved, the egg-shaped chamber was gone, replaced by a crater of fused alloy still glowing at the edges, smoke curling upward into an atmosphere scrubber that hadn't been designed to handle this much particulate at once. Nothing moved in the wreckage. For nearly a full minute, nothing moved at all, and Ves allowed herself the smallest measure of relief, because a dead human was a solvable problem. A dead human meant the war, if it came to war, would look like every other war she'd fought. Predictable. Winnable. Then something shifted in the smoke. At first she thought it was debris settling, a support beam finishing its collapse. But the shape rose instead of falling, wrong in every dimension for wreckage, until it resolved into a silhouette standing upright in the center of the crater. Ves's analysts, clustered around the secondary display, went silent one by one as the feed sharpened. Reyes stood in the ruin of the chamber, what remained of his uniform hanging off him in blackened strips, skin raw and weeping along one side of his face and neck, one arm held at an angle that suggested something structural had broken and hadn't yet been given permission to matter. He was alive, not thriving, not unscathed, clearly in agony by any reasonable measure Ves's species used to judge such things. But alive, standing, and... She watched this happen in real time and did not, For several seconds, trust the sensor feed to be showing her the truth, looking directly up into the one remaining camera as though he had known exactly where to find it. The analyst nearest her, a younger officer named Thal who had never seen combat, made a small strangled sound. "Commander, he should be vapor." "I can see that he isn't," Vess said, though her voice had lost some of the flatness she prided herself on. On the screen, Reyes's mouth moved. There was no audio pickup that close to the blast radius, the primary microphones having been destroyed along with everything else in the chamber. But the secondary sensor array, built for atmospheric analysis, not surveillance, and therefore still functional, caught enough of the vibration in the air to reconstruct 2 syllables. The translation matrix processed it a half-second later and displayed the result across every screen in the command deck simultaneously, stark and small and somehow worse for how simple it was. "Again, please." Nobody spoke. Vess stared at the 2 words until they blurred, trying to force them into a shape that made sense. A threat? A taunt? Some coded challenge she was failing to parse because the translation matrix had made an error. But the matrix didn't make errors, not with a phrase this basic, and the longer she looked at it, the more she understood that the words meant exactly what they said, which was somehow more unsettling than any threat could have been. "He wants us to do it again," Thal said quietly. "He's in shock," another officer offered, though without much conviction. "Damaged neural function. It's not a rational request." Vess said nothing. She was watching the feed, watching Reyes sway once on his feet and then, remarkably, steady himself, one hand pressed against his ruined side, and she was thinking about the phrase mutually assured survival and wondering, for the first time since she'd read it, whether the analysts had gotten the emphasis wrong. Not survival as aggression. Survival as method. "Get me the fleet physician," she said, "and pull everything we have on human biology. Everything. I want to know what I just watched." They moved him to a medical bay 3 decks down, not out of mercy. Vess made that distinction clear to her crew more than once in the following hours, but out of necessity. A specimen that had done the impossible was worth more alive and studied than dead and wasted, and if there was even a fractional chance his survival represented some engineered trait rather than a fluke, the coalition needed to understand it before they encountered 100 more of him. Reyes drifted in and out of consciousness for the better part of a day, tended by a physician named Sale who approached the human body with the clinical fascination of someone dissecting a puzzle rather than treating a patient, though she was, Reyes had to admit through the haze of whatever painkiller equivalent they'd found that worked on his physiology, at least gentle about it. The burns across his side and neck had been cleaned and covered in something cool that dulled the worst of the pain. His arm had been set, badly by human standards but competently enough that he suspected it would heal straight. He woke fully somewhere in the second day, the ceiling above him unfamiliar and low, the hum of the ship's systems different from the meridians in ways he couldn't articulate but could feel, like a song played in a key slightly off from the one he knew. Sale was there when his eyes opened, for vertical pupils fixed on him with an intensity that would have been rude by human social standards and was, he assumed, simply professional by hers. "You are conscious," she said. Her voice arrived through the same neural translation as Vess's had, pressure behind the eyes rather than true sound. "You have been asking, in your unconscious state, for repetition of an event that should have killed you. I would like to understand why." Reyes took a slow breath. It hurt, but less than he expected. "How long was I asleep? Irrelevant to my question. Maybe to you." He pushed himself up an inch, testing the limits of what his body would allow, and found them fairly generous given the circumstances. "I'll answer yours if you answer one of mine first." "Fair trade." Sale's head tilted, the same gesture Vess had made in the chamber before the detonation, and Reyes filed that away as probably a species-wide expression of confusion or reassessment. "Humans do not typically negotiate from positions of total physical vulnerability. Humans negotiate from every position," Reyes said. "That's kind of the whole point of us." She considered this for a long moment, then made a small clicking sound he took for assent. "Ask. Why'd you nuke a sealed room with a live prisoner inside it instead of just asking me questions? Seems like a waste of a source. Your species' historical record suggested interrogation would fail regardless of method. Total neutralization was deemed the more efficient use of resources. We did not expect a return on investment beyond confirming your death." Sale's 4 eyes narrowed slightly. You have not answered mine. Reyes exhaled, and for the first time since waking, allowed himself something close to a real smile, tired and thin but genuine. You want to know why I asked for another one? Yes. Because I wanted the data, he said simply. You people just ran an experiment on me without a control group, without instrumentation, without so much as a follow-up scan before you dragged me out of there. I've spent my whole career studying how bodies and systems fail under pressure. You handed me the single best sample size of information about my own species' survival threshold that anyone has ever collected, and then you didn't even let me watch it happen properly. Of course I wanted another one. Any scientist would. Sale went very still, an unnatural stillness that Reyes suspected, correctly, unsettled her more than she wanted to show. You are telling me the request was not defiance. It wasn't defiance, Reyes agreed. It was curiosity. I know that's probably a harder thing for you to sit with than a threat would have been. Threats you can plan for. Curiosity's a lot messier. You believe your survival was not extraordinary. I believe it wasn't an accident, Reyes said, and something in his tone shifted. The diplomat's practiced calm giving way, just slightly, to something colder and more precise underneath it. There's a difference. You read our history and saw a species that keeps building weapons capable of destroying itself and never uses the good sense to disarm. What you didn't read, because it's not the kind of thing that ends up in a threat assessment, is what we built alongside those weapons while we were busy not using them on each other. Bunkers rated for direct strikes. Cities engineered to survive fallout and rebuild inside a generation. Bodies, populations, genetics, medicine, pushed for decades toward resilience against exactly the kind of event you just tried on me, because we did this to ourselves first, over and over, long before you ever found us. You didn't run a new experiment, Doctor. You ran one we'd already finished the results on a long time ago. Sale did not respond immediately. Reyes watched something move behind her eyes that he recognized from 100 negotiations across a dozen worlds. The exact moment an opponent stopped seeing a prisoner and started seeing a variable they hadn't accounted for. I will need to report this, she said finally. I'd expect nothing less, Reyes said. Tell your commander I'm happy to answer more questions. Properly this time. No detonations required. Sale did not leave immediately. She lingered by the edge of his cot, her 4 eyes tracking the slow rise and fall of his breathing with the same clinical attention she'd given his burns, though something in her posture had shifted since the conversation began. May I ask you something outside the report, she said, that I will not include in it. Reyes studied her for a moment, weighing the request against 11 years of instinct that told him nothing said aboard an enemy vessel was ever truly off the record. But something about the way she'd asked, carefully, almost hesitantly, a tone he hadn't heard from any of her people yet, made him decide it was worth the risk. Go ahead. Were you afraid? Sale said, standing in that chamber before the device detonated. Yes, Reyes said without hesitation. Completely. I want to be clear about that because I think it's the part your reports are going to leave out if I don't say it myself. I wasn't calm because I wasn't scared. I was calm because being scared and being useless aren't the same thing, and somewhere along the way my species figured out how to keep those two things separate. That's not magic. That's just practice. A lot of practice spread out over a very long time, by a lot of people who never got to see whether it worked. And now you have, Sale said. Now I have, Reyes agreed. I'd have rather not found out this way, but I understand why you did what you did. If I'd read the file your analysts wrote about us, I'm not sure I'd have made a different call than your commander did. That's the uncomfortable part of all this, if you want the honest version. Nobody here was wrong to be afraid. We were just afraid of the wrong thing. Sale considered this in silence for a long moment, and when she finally turned to leave, she paused once more at the doorway, her voice quieter than it had been through the rest of the exchange. I do not know what to do with that. Nobody ever does the first time, Reyes said. Give it a few days. It gets easier to sit with. Eventually, word of what had happened in the medical bay spread through the flagship faster than any official channel could contain it, and by the time the analyst team convened in their cramped review chamber 2 decks below the bridge, half of them had already heard 3 different versions of the story, each one stranger than the last. He asked for a second detonation, said Orin, the youngest of the group, still visibly shaken. That's what the transcript says. Word for word. The transcript says he asked for repetition, corrected Fen, the team's senior statistician, a methodical presence who had built her entire career on not getting ahead of the data. Repetition is not the same as detonation. We are assuming intent we have not confirmed. Does it matter? He survived a tactical yield in a sealed chamber. The intent behind 2 words is not the headline here. Orin pulled up the sensor readings from the blast, cycling through thermal and radiation overlays that painted the crater in shifting false colors. Look at this decay curve. His core body temperature should have spiked past survivable thresholds within the first half second. Instead it plateaus here. He pointed. Like something intervened. Some kind of internal regulation we don't have a model for. Fen leaned in, studying the curve with the same flat scrutiny she gave every anomaly that crossed her desk, refusing to let herself be impressed until the math told her to be. That's not a biological curve. That's an engineered one. Biology doesn't plateau like that on its own, not even under extreme adaptive pressure. Something in his physiology was built or trained or medicated to do exactly what it did. The physician's report supports that, Orin said. He described it himself. Centuries of preparation. Bunkers, medicine, population-level conditioning. He wasn't unique. He said any of them would have done roughly the same. That is the part of this I find hardest to sit with, Fen admitted, and for a moment the clinical distance in her voice cracked just slightly. We built our entire threat model on the idea that this species was reckless, self-destructive, a danger to itself first and to us only by extension. If what he's telling us is true, we had the shape of it backwards. They are not reckless. They are the single most methodically prepared species we have ever encountered, and the recklessness was only ever the part visible from the outside, the part that looked like carelessness because we didn't understand what was holding it up underneath. Nobody in the room had an answer for that, and the silence that followed carried the particular weight of an assumption dying all at once, the kind that reorganized everything built on top of it. Vess received the physician's report alone in her quarters because some information needed to be absorbed before it could be shared without causing panic, and she suspected, correctly, that this qualified. She read it twice through, then a third time, focusing on the section where Sale had transcribed Reyes's explanation nearly word for word, flagged with her own clinical annotation. Subject's account is consistent with observed physiological resilience. Recommend treating claim as credible pending further verification. Threat assessment should be revised upward, not downward. Vess set the report down and sat for a long while in the dim quiet of her cabin, turning over a question that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the shape of the war she might now be walking into. Every coalition strategy for dealing with an unknown threat rested on the same foundational assumption: that overwhelming, decisive force ended problems before they could compound. It was why she'd authorized the strike in the first place, why the analysts had recommended total neutralization over negotiation, why the entire doctrine of first contact with a hostile classified species began and ended with the largest weapon available. But Reyes's answer suggested something the doctrine hadn't accounted for. Not a species that had gotten lucky, or been engineered by some outside force into unnatural toughness, or possessed some biological quirk that made them hard to kill in the way certain unpleasant insects were hard to kill. A species that had, with total deliberation and across the whole of its recorded history, treated its own worst weapon as a design problem to be solved rather than an existential threat to be avoided. They hadn't survived nuclear war by chance. They'd survived it because at some point, faced with the fact that they were never going to fully disarm, they'd decided the next best option was making sure nothing they built could actually finish the job, including themselves. That wasn't luck. That wasn't resilience in the way the coalition understood the term, some passive trait like a thick hide or a redundant organ. That was preparation, sustained across centuries, aimed specifically at surviving the exact scenario Vess had just tested. She had, in effect, walked into a fight that this species had been rehearsing against itself since before her own people had developed spaceflight. She thought about the 2 words again. Again, please. Not defiance, Sale's report insisted, but curiosity, a request for more data, delivered by a man standing in the ashes of an attack that should have erased him from existence, because he genuinely wanted to know more about what had almost killed him. Vess had led 14 boarding actions. She had faced down enemies who screamed, who begged, who fought with a desperation that told her exactly how much they feared death. She had never once faced an enemy who looked at his own near annihilation and asked, calmly, for a repeat performance in the interest of better data. That request scared her far more than any threat could have, because a threat told you what your enemy was willing to do to you. Curiosity like that told you what your enemy had already survived doing to themselves. She called a full council session for the following morning. Before she did, she sent one additional order down to the medical bay, brief and specific. Captain Reyes was no longer to be classified as a prisoner. He was to be treated, going forward, as a diplomatic contact, carefully, respectfully, and under close observation, because Vessathur had built her entire career on recognizing threats before they fully arrived, and she was no longer certain the greatest threat in this scenario was the one she'd already tried and failed to eliminate. The council chamber aboard the coalition flagship was arranged in a wide horseshoe, 6 senior officers and 3 civilian analysts seated around a central holographic display that currently showed nothing but a slowly rotating model of the Meridian, still held in the docking bay 3 sectors over. Reyes stood at the open end of the horseshoe, his arm in a sling of coalition design, the burns along his neck fading from raw red to something more manageable, flanked by 2 guards who seemed, by this point, more like escorts than captors. Vess called the session to order and did not waste time on preamble. Captain Reyes has made a claim regarding his survival that our medical staff assess as credible. I want to hear it directly, and I want this council to understand the implications before we decide anything further about the status of this contact, or the status of the war some of you were prepared to recommend 3 days ago. Reyes stepped forward, favoring his splinted arm slightly, and looked around the horseshoe with the unhurried patience of a man who had given this exact kind of presentation, in one form or another, more times than he could count. I'll keep this simple, he said. You studied our history and saw a species with an appetite for self-destruction it never quite acted on. That's accurate as far as it goes. What it misses is the other half of the story, the half where, because we knew we'd never fully talk ourselves out of building those weapons, we spent just as much effort making sure we could survive using them or having them used against us. Deep bunkers, reinforced cities, medical countermeasures refined over decades of testing, some of it on animals, some of it later on volunteers who understood exactly what they were signing up for. None of it happened overnight. All of it happened because at some point, a very long time ago, we accepted a hard fact. We were never going to be a species that fully disarmed. So we became a species that engineered survival instead. One of the civilian analysts, an older figure with mottled gray skin and a voice that carried genuine, unguarded alarm, leaned forward. You are telling us your species deliberately hardened itself against its own extinction weapons. As policy, as culture, as instinct by now, Reyes said. It's not something most of us even think about day to day. It's just underneath everything. The bunkers under our cities aren't relics. A lot of them are still maintained, still stocked, still tested. The medical protocols I benefited from 3 days ago weren't improvised. They were developed over generations and refined every time we learned something new about radiation exposure, blast trauma, systemic shock. You didn't stumble onto a fluke when you detonated that device. You stumbled onto the end result of centuries of very deliberate, very expensive work, and you got to see it succeed on an ordinary officer with no special augmentation, because ordinary is exactly what that work was built to protect. The chamber went quiet. Vess watched the faces around the horseshoe shift through the same progression hers had gone through alone in her cabin the night before. Disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked uncomfortably close to fear, though every officer present would have described it, if pressed, as caution. Not every face held steady, though. Commander Draus, seated at the far end of the horseshoe, had commanded the strike wing that carried out the original detonation, and he rose now with the stiff posture of a man who had staked his reputation on a decision he was not prepared to see unravel in open council. With respect, he said, we are being asked to reorganize our entire defense posture around the unverified claims of a prisoner who has every incentive to make his species sound unbeatable. He is a diplomat. Persuasion is his function. We should not confuse a compelling story for a fact. It is not unverified, Sale said from her seat near the back of the chamber, speaking for the first time since the session began. I examined him myself. The physiological markers are consistent with sustained, generational adaptation, not improvisation under duress. Whatever policy produced this outcome, it was not invented 3 days ago to impress us. Then perhaps it was invented years ago to impress exactly the kind of enemy who might one day stand where we are standing. Drouse shot back. A prepared story is still a story, Doctor, however long they had to write it. Reyes let the exchange run its course without interrupting, recognizing in Drouse the particular flavor of officer every fleet produced. The one who had committed fully to a hard decision and could not now afford, professionally or personally, to believe that decision had been a mistake. He'd negotiated across from men like Drouse before on 3 different worlds, and knew that arguing directly against that kind of certainty rarely worked. It needed room to exhaust itself first. Commander Drouse raises a fair concern, Reyes said finally, once the silence had stretched long enough to invite him back in. I would raise the same one in your position. So let me offer something besides my word for it. He gestured toward the still-rotating model of the Meridian hovering above the central display. My ship carries full medical and engineering logs going back years. Radiation shielding specifications. Trauma protocols. Population resilience studies my own government has published openly, because we've never treated this the way you're treating it now, as a secret weapon. We treat it as public infrastructure, the same way you'd treat a road or a water system. You're welcome to pull every record off that ship and verify it against what your physician found in my body. I'm not asking you to trust a story. I'm asking you to check the math. Drouse said nothing for a long moment, some of the rigidity going out of his shoulders as the offer settled. An argument he clearly had not expected and could not easily dismiss. Vess watched him carefully, understanding that his objection, however inconvenient, had done something valuable. It had forced the claim to survive scrutiny in the open, in front of the whole council, rather than settling quietly into consensus unchallenged. Pull the logs, Vess said to the officer beside her. Cross-reference everything against Dr. Sale's findings. If Commander Drouse's concerns hold up under that comparison, I want to know before this council adjourns. And if they don't, she looked back at Drouse, not unkindly, then I want that on the record too. We don't get to selectively remember which parts of this encounter we're comfortable with. Drouse inclined his head, not quite an apology but close enough to one, and sat back down. If this is accurate, Vess said slowly, then every strategic model this coalition has built around engaging your species is built on a false premise. We assumed total force would produce total results. Your survival suggests total force produces, at best, a delay, and at worst, a demonstration you find useful. That's about the shape of it, Reyes agreed. I want to be clear, though, because I think this is the part people usually get wrong when they hear all this. It's not that we don't feel it. That detonation hurt. It hurt more than almost anything I've experienced, and I've had a long career doing a job that doesn't usually end well for the people who do it too long. We're not indestructible. We're not eager for it, either, whatever image you got from studying our history from a distance. What we are is prepared. There's a difference between a species that doesn't fear death and a species that decided, collectively, a long time ago, not to let fear of death be the only thing standing between it and survival. We built the second option because the first one isn't real. Nobody's actually fearless. We just refused to let being afraid be the end of the planning. The older analyst spoke again, quieter this time. Then what would you recommend, Captain, if the decision were yours? Knowing what you know about us, and what we now know about you. Reyes glanced at Vess before he answered, and something passed between them that wasn't quite trust yet, but was, perhaps, the beginning of the kind of respect that made trust eventually possible. I'd recommend you stop treating first contact with an unfamiliar species as a problem to be solved with the biggest weapon in the room, he said. Not because it's wrong to be cautious, I understand why you did what you did, and honestly, if our positions were reversed and I'd read the same file on your people that your analysts read on mine, I might have made a similar call. But you've now seen what happens when caution turns into overwhelming force against an opponent who spent centuries preparing for exactly that outcome. Next time, you might not get an officer standing in the crater asking politely for better data. You might get a whole population that decides the diplomatic option stopped being on the table the moment the first device was armed. I'd rather that never happens. I suspect now you'd rather that too. Vess held his gaze across the chamber for a long moment, weighing everything she'd learned in the last 3 days against 14 years of doctrine that had never once failed her before this. Then she rose from her seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular weight of someone choosing a harder, slower path over a familiar, faster one, because the faster one had just shown her exactly where it ended. "Stand down the fleet's alert status," she said to the officer beside her. "Recall the strike wing still holding position near the meridian." She turned back to Reyes. "You said you'd answer more questions. Properly this time." "I did," Reyes said. "And I meant it." "Then let's begin," Vess said. "With the part of your history you said we hadn't read yet. All of it. I want to understand exactly what kind of species we almost went to war with before either of us decides we still have to." Reyes allowed himself, finally, a small and genuine smile. Not the calm diplomat's mask he'd worn since the moment he woke in a cell with no corners, but something closer to relief, the particular relief of a man who had walked out of an impossible situation not by winning it, but by making sure the people who'd started it finally understood what they'd been standing next to all along. "That," he said, "is going to take a while. You might want to sit back down." Around the horseshoe, one by one, the officers who 3 days earlier had voted for total neutralization did exactly that, and Vessather understood, watching them settle in to listen, that the 2 words which had scared her fleet more than any weapon in coalition arsenal hadn't been a threat at all. They'd been an invitation. And for the first time since the war had almost started, someone had finally decided to accept it. 3 months later, the Meridian limped back into human space under its own power, escorted for the final leg of the journey by a single coalition vessel that peeled away at the edge of the system rather than risk provoking a defense grid it now understood far better than it had at the start of the encounter. Reyes stood on the bridge for that last approach, his arm long-heeled, a thin pale line along his neck the only visible reminder of the crater he'd once stood in. Okoye was at her station again, alive and unhurt, having spent the last 3 months as a guest rather than a prisoner once Vess's revised protocols took hold across the fleet. She glanced over at him as Earth resolved into a blue crescent on the main display. "They're going to want a full report," she said. "Every word of it. What are you going to tell them?" Reyes considered the question longer than she expected, watching the planet grow larger, thinking about a commander who had ordered his execution and then spent 3 months learning, slowly and against every instinct her career had trained into her, how to ask questions instead of just detonating them. "I'm going to tell them we scared an entire fleet without firing a single shot," he said finally, "and that the scariest thing we've got isn't a weapon at all. It's that we've spent centuries getting ready for the worst day we could imagine. And most days, most of us don't even think about it anymore. It's just there. Underneath everything." He paused, watching the Terminator line crawl slowly across the curve of the planet below. "I think that's worth more to us going forward than any fleet we could build. Let's just hope we never have to prove it again quite that loudly." Okoye almost smiled. 2 words did all that. 2 words, Reyes agreed. "And everything underneath them,"